Cambridge has a long and rich tradition of people imagining the future. We are nurturing the ideas and producing the innovations that will be passed down to following generations. Tackling subjects that range from the application of biomechanical modelling when identifying injuries, to the use of child-robot interactions in supporting mental health, our researchers are truly at the forefront of global discovery and invention. The researchers that you will hear from are seeking not only to understand the world today, but also to imagine the world we may live in tomorrow. I invite you to join me to learn how Cambridge researchers are helping to make the world better for all of us.
So my PhD ultimately came down to an incident involving a giant human-powered hamster wheel. Before that, I'd been a bit uncertain what I wanted to research. I knew I loved engineering, I knew I wanted to do research, but I wasn't quite sure what area I wanted to focus in. But I had this accident in which my leg was crushed by a giant hamster wheel. And through the recovery process of that, I ultimately learned that I had a genetic disorder that affects the collagen throughout my entire body. And experiencing these injuries, I realized that I loved studying them from the mechanical perspective, understanding what was going on both in causing the injury and throughout the recovery process. And that ultimately led me to be here, studying biomechanics to understand injuries and how they affect the way we move and walk. I'm Lindy Zollinger, and I am studying how we can use machine learning gait analysis to help us to determine injuries in both humans and dogs. So it can be very difficult to diagnose injuries in dogs. They can't walk up to you and say, "My knee hurts. Take a look at it, let's figure out what's wrong." I can go to my GP and do that. They can't. We have to rely on observing their behavior, seeing if they're limping, if they're acting strange, and then we have to locate what's the source of the pain, and then figure out, okay, what's causing the pain. And it can be a slow and difficult process. It's much harder to give a dog an MRI. You can't simply just tell them to lay still and not move. And so it's very helpful to have tools to guide us in detecting when there's an injury and helping us to know, should we look further into this? And that's where my research really comes into play. We're using a treadmill to help to detect injuries in dogs. So we walk dogs on a treadmill that records a whole lot of information about the way they're walking, everything from the amount of force they're putting through their paws to the length of each step that they take. And through that information, we can figure out what areas are causing pain, if there is possibly an injury that we need to look into further. If there is an injury, can we detect what area it's in to help us localize, okay, we need to take imaging of the knee, or we need to assess the hip more, and help us to be able to sort of narrow down that field and make the diagnosis process easier on both vets and dog. So with all this data, that's where machine learning comes in. Computers are really good at picking up on patterns, especially patterns that sometimes we as humans don't recognize. And with machine learning, we're able to assess those patterns and to look and see what the data is actually telling us. Can we detect the patterns that tell us what part of a dog is injured, or that tell us that this dog isn't quite walking right and we need to examine them further? So if you think about it in a human, if I were to break my small toe, I would likely roll my foot inwards to avoid putting weight through that toe. And that's going to have carry-on effects through the way I walk. It's going to affect how much weight I put through my foot. It's going to affect the contact area of my foot with the ground. It's going to affect the angles of different joints in my leg as I walk. And by analyzing those patterns, I will be able to use a computer to tell me, okay, this suggests that she's not putting weight through the outside of her foot. That means we need to look at the outside of the foot for the injury, and that can help us narrow down further where the diagnosis should be, as well as helping us to detect that there is an injury in the first place if we don't know that there's one there. So this data contains a lot of information, and one of the cool areas that it can really help us with is understanding differences between dog breeds. There's generally studies on a particular breed, so there will be a study on Labrador Retrievers, there will be a study on German Shepherds. But then when you get a dog who's a crossbreed, say a Cockapoo, there's not a lot of information on them. And it can be difficult to say, this is what's normal for a Cockapoo. And so through this study, using a lot of data and patterns in machine learning, we can figure out what should be normal for a dog. Based off of its size and characteristics, can we figure out, this is the healthy gait of a Cockapoo. This is the healthy gait of a Labradoodle. And through that, then we'll be able to apply that to a larger number of dogs than just our standard German Shepherd study. And that will enable us to be able to improve the welfare of a lot more dogs, especially in today's society. There's a lot more crossbreeds, mixed breeds, and it's hard to generalize things without large amounts of data that can help us to detect those patterns between the different characteristics in the dogs. So this can be helpful in humans as well. One of the struggles in doing human medical research is that generally your research is limited by the diversity of the population around you, and so it's easy to miss key factors in what you're trying to study, and not all sort of generalized parameters will fit well to a given person. So if you think of a BMI in humans, it doesn't always fit well to explain different sizes and shapes of humans. And so with these machine learning techniques, we can develop better models and parameters to help us determine what is a normal parameter for a given human based off of their size, their shape, and what is true for them rather than what should be generalized to a population. But when I started my PhD, I had planned to study both humans and dogs. COVID hit before I began my PhD, and because of delays at the hospital and through the clinic I was collaborating with, I had to stop my human research and focus entirely on dogs. But since then, the clinic has now reopened, and I've been mentoring a master's student who is working on a project studying gait analysis in human amputees. He is hoping to carry forward some more of the work that I was planning to do. He has applied for a PhD and is waiting to hear back on his funding decisions. So I've worked with a lot of dogs. One in particular is my dog Borelli. She's named after Giovanni Alfonso Borelli, who is considered to be the father of biomechanics. He studied animal locomotion, so her name felt very fitting when we got her. And she not only has been a volunteer in some of my research studies, she has also been, I've been training her to help me around the house with some of the tasks that I struggle with, such as picking things up that I've dropped or fetching items when I'm in an emergency, fetching help if I'm in an emergency. And so she's been a huge help to me in being able to get done the work that I need to and to have support around.
Also my husband, but...
Maybe you or someone you know has or is suffering from depression. The World Health Organization defines depression as a disability and estimates that 1 in every 6 people will suffer from depression at some point in their lifetime. What's more, the COVID-19 pandemic is thought to have increased rates of depression by over 25%. But these are all only very rough estimates because as yet, we don't have a precise definition of what depression actually is. We know depression is more than just feeling sad. In addition to persistent feelings of hopelessness and despair, there are behavioral changes like withdrawing from social contact and even physical changes like disruption to sleeping and eating patterns. But what we don't yet understand is what could be the underlying biology giving rise to all these complex depressive symptoms. My name's Richard. I'm a PhD student in psychiatric neuroscience, and I'm trying to answer the question, what is the biology of mental health? So to explain where we are with depression today, I like to borrow an analogy from my supervisor, which is, imagine there was such a thing as a cough disease. You're coughing, so you go to the doctor, and they say, oh, you have the cough disease, without knowing whether perhaps that cough is caused by COVID or tuberculosis or pneumonia, or maybe you just have something stuck in your throat, all of which would require a different treatment. And that's about where we are with our understanding of depression today. We don't know what the underlying cause might be of these array of symptoms that we call depression. Currently, the way we diagnose mental health disorders is entirely based on subjective data. So that means a patient telling a psychiatrist how they feel and maybe how their life is going. But one of the problems with this is that different psychiatrists could give different diagnoses. One person might say, oh, you have depression, whereas another psychiatrist would say, oh, you have anxiety, and maybe prescribe different treatments. So it's clear we can only go so far in our understanding with subjective data alone. And that's where biological data comes in. A really exciting new opportunity is the ability to measure levels of RNA throughout our bodies. So we all know about DNA. We can think of RNA as how our DNA is expressed in our cells to make us who we are. But unlike DNA, which stays largely fixed throughout our lifetimes, RNA is changing constantly in response to all the experiences and environmental impacts that we go through. And since we know depression, like many mental health disorders, is often caused by environmental factors like our relationships or socioeconomic circumstances, studying RNA offers a window into how these complex environmental causes may change our underlying biology. 10 years ago, a major study using RNA samples might have had only 10 or less than 100 samples, and these days we're working with over 1,000 samples. And this explosion of data has created new opportunities to use techniques like unsupervised machine learning to try and understand the patterns in the biology of RNA that may help explain what is going on in mental illness like depression. What we can do is take a data set where we have the RNA levels from some people who didn't have depression and from other people who did, and look at what the differences are. And so we might see all sorts of differences related to different biological processes like the metabolism. And one of the hypotheses I'm hoping to explore in my PhD is that there may be specific subgroups of people who suffer from depression whose depression is caused by specific biological processes. In particular, there's lots of evidence that the immune system may be related to depression. So, for example, parts of our body have a heightened immune response or inflamed, and this causes mental distress that we see as depression. And these people may need a specific treatment for their depression that is different to other patients. So going back to the analogy of the cough disease, what I'm hoping to do is tease apart what the different underlying biological disorders might be that today we all lump together as one broad category of depression. So today there are many different treatments for depression on offer. There are the traditional treatments like antidepressant drug therapies, as well as psychotherapy, of course. And there are also newer treatments emerging, in particular mindfulness and maybe even psychedelic therapies. But if you just take antidepressants, for example, the current estimate is that these are only effective about 1/3 of the time. And one of the thoughts is that this may be because there are actually these different underlying disorders, like in the cough disease, and we're not, in most cases, prescribing the right treatment for the right person. So what really excites me is that there are so many new kinds of data becoming available today, everything from brain scans to genetics. And so if we can figure out what the real causes of depression are, we may have new treatments that are specific to these different underlying diseases, and eventually have new clinical tests so that we know which specific treatment is most likely to be effective for which person, entering this new world of personalized mental health treatment. So I really think that in the next few decades, within our lifetimes, we have the opportunity to make great progress on understanding the underlying biology of mental health and illness. If I were to describe where I think we are today, we've spent a long time trying to climb the wrong mountain, but now we're at the right base camp, looking up at Everest, and we know where we need to go to get there. And that makes me really optimistic.
Hi, my name is Nell. I am very excited to meet you. I am a robot, and this week, I will be talking to you and other children like you to understand children better. I will be asking you a few questions, showing you a few pictures, and we are just going to chat about them. This is not a test or assessment to pass or fail. It is just a chat to find out about you. Is that okay? Please press the orange part of my right twist for yes. Otherwise, press the orange part of my left twist for no, and I can call Nida to explain again.
Hi, I am Nida Itrat Abbasi, and I use the Now robot for the assessment of mental well-being in children. Before the start of the entire interaction, we get the child comfortable with the robot in the interaction rooms. There are 2 rooms that are located adjacent to each other. In the interaction room contains the child and the robot that's separated with a one-way screen with the control room where we're present along with the parents, and they can monitor the entire interaction. We don't really describe the entire session because we hope that the robot can do that, but we do describe the conditions related to the interaction, telling the child that if at all they would like to stop the interaction, they can at any point of time. If they would like to skip certain parts of it, that's also allowed. If they want to stop, we just tell them to tell the robot or wave, and we can stop. So it's totally dependent on how the child feels and how comfortable the child is.
Thank you for your answers. You did very well. Would you like to take a break now?
Now is actually a very childlike robot. The robot does about 4 tasks with them, but before it does those tasks, it kind of does this warm-up exercise or an icebreaker session just to kind of get the children comfortable with the robot and the functionalities of the robot.
Let us have some fun before we get started. Do you want to give me a fist bump?
Then it moves on to task 1, which is it asks the children to recall one recent happy memory and one recent sad memory.
Maybe something or somebody made you upset? Can you tell me about it?
Task 2 is basically, it does this established psychological questionnaire called as the Short Moods and Feelings Questionnaire.
I am going to make some statements about you, but I do not know whether they are true, or sometimes true or are not true. Please respond with how you might have felt mostly over the past 2 weeks.
Task 3 is where it's the picture task.
Now I would like to show you some pictures. What do you think is happening in this picture?
And it concludes the session with the revised child anxiety and depression subscale, which is also another established psychological questionnaire, certain subscales of that.
Remember, there is no right or wrong answer.
The children were asked to fill that in terms of their own well-being, which is called as the self-report. The parents were also asked to fill that in terms of the children's well-being, that's called as a parent report. And the robot asked the same questionnaire. So when we compared between these 3 modes of administration, that is self-report versus parent report and robot report, we found that the robot report was more incisive.
Thank you for telling me about your day.
There are many reasons for that, but one of the main reasons that we believe could be that children are very, very tactile. Say, for instance, when they're interacting with like screen-based tools, they're kind of withdrawn from the physical world. So that's why robot is a very unique tool, because it's actually present in the physical world and it's interactive. So the children find it very, very engaging. Also, it is very looks very non-threatening, and there have been many studies that have looked into how robots are used as social companions for children and how children consider it as a social peer. And we believe this could be a contributing factor to why we got these kind of findings. I'm actually an engineering major, both in my bachelor's and in my master's. During my master's, I worked on understanding, it was more signal processing and understanding how the brain activity changes during long monotonous tasks. In my case, it was driving on a long mundane road and using haptics as an enhancement strategy. When I came here, this was a very, very exciting project. There was never a dull moment, and I often tell people that are very close to me that we should be more like children and have that innocence and that inquisitiveness is just really, really interesting and amazing to watch. We hope that the robots are available in places like schools so that early identification is possible. We do not hope to replace any psychologists, mental health professionals or clinicians, because their expertise far surpasses anything that a robot can do or will be able to do. But we hope that they could use that as a tool for early identification.
Nope, nope.
Growing up in southeastern Nigeria, I would always hear elderly people around me say things like, before the war, or if not for the war, this would have happened. And I always wondered, what is this war? Why was I not taught about this in school? Why has this war had such impact on the lives of these people that they continue to make reference to it at any given point? And what is the nature of this impact on the lives of the people? So now, coming to Cambridge, I'm part of a group of people who are looking into the relationship between the legacies of violent conflict and cultural heritage, but not only from a destructive point of view, but also from a generative and regenerative point of view. Hello, my name is Stanley Onyemechalu. I am exploring the relationship between cultural heritage and the legacies of violent conflict. Part of the motivations for my application here was my supervisor, Dr. Dathia Vejo-Rose, an expert on the Spanish Civil War, and I found that it had some similarities with the Nigerian Civil War, which was my case. And more recently, she's been consulting for UNESCO on issues related to recent conflicts around the world. The Nigerian Civil War, or as I like to call it, the Nigeria-Biafra War, happened between 1967 and 1970. claiming over 1 million lives. Biafra since then has turned into both an ideology, more than just a geographical space, into even a dirty word right now in Nigeria, where within the political class, the name Biafra or even the word Biafra cannot be mentioned without some suspicions or eyebrows being raised. Particularly for me during my master's, I remember being warned to stick to calling it the Nigerian Civil War rather than the Biafra War or even the Nigeria-Biafra War, as that might be considered unacceptable for examination. So all of these sort of summarize the kind of legacies that war, even though 53 years ago, continues to have on today's society in Nigeria. Since the war ended, there's been efforts by the government, especially at the federal level, to try to commemorate the war. And the best effort so far is the National War Museum, repurposed one of the bunkers used during the war by the defunct Biafran side for the museum, showing a lot of the relics from the war. The National War Museum is being run by the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, but with interferences by the Nigerian Army or the Nigerian military. And so this has created a lot of representational issues for the museum themselves, but also for the history of the war. There are lots of analysis and expert opinion on how these interferences or encumbrances have impeded the museum's own effort to accurately represent the war history, as well as to promote peaceful narratives through its representation. My PhD research and the approach to conflict heritage is valuable because it seeks to fill the gap in conflict heritage discipline, where a lot of focus is placed on the tangible impact of conflict on heritage, as well as its destructive impacts on heritage, leaving behind very few studies on the intangible heritage impacts of conflict, as well as the generative dimensions of conflict on cultural heritage in general. So using the Nigerian Civil War, I'm trying to explore how conflict or how violent conflict, as well as its legacies, can impact and transform the cultural heritage landscape of the Igbo people in southeastern Nigeria. And this is combining both the tangible heritage dimension to it, as well as the intangible heritage dimension to it. Generally, conflict has a destructive impact on cultural heritage, but not so much is known about how conflict can have other kinds of impact, and in this case, a generative or regenerative impact on cultural heritage. And so studies like mine are beginning to pave the way to show a more holistic understanding of how conflict and its legacies can destructively or generatively impact cultural heritage. During my research, I've discovered certain foods that were introduced as a result of the war, or certain things that became pronounced within the culinary practices of the people as a result of the war. And one of such things is the abacha, which is made from cassava, some sort of like cassava flakes, that was popularized during the war because of the nature of its preparation. So it's easy to prepare, it's light to carry and run, and it can last for days on end, and you can still eat it. So another example of such items would be the stockfish. This was a way for many of the aid agencies at the time to send in salt and protein to the starving people in the Biafran region during the war. So images of starving children that we saw during the late 60s from Nigeria was from this region. And so some of the answers to that was to send stockfish from places like Norway that were laced with salt and dried. And so that has continued to become a staple within the soups and even the cuisines prepared in Igbo Nigeria today. And we also have music, songs and dance that were generated as a result of the Nigerian Civil War. One of such examples is the Ojile dance in a place called Nsukka, Nigeria, specifically Enugu Ezike. I found that this community created this dance during the war. Some of them said because the war passed the community very quickly. They had a lot of time on their hands, you know, not knowing where they belonged to, whether they were part of the Biafra side or the Nigerian side. So for the whole time the war lasted, they were in something called unclaimed territory. And so during that time, this particular community formed a dance that was made up of social commentary and all sorts of things. I also found an interesting generative impact that the war had in terms of football. So a football club called Rangers FC in Enugu State, Nigeria, owes its history to the legacies of the Nigerian Civil War. And in the years following after the war, many of the players that were drafted into these football teams used to be soldiers during the war, and so they sort of said they were bringing the fight outside the war front and onto the football pitch. And so they were trying to continue that struggle for self-determination, as it were, on the football pitch or through football. And so I found that many of the chants that were used during the war were repurposed as football chants for this particular football team. Until today, they continue to be regarded as one of the legacies of the Nigerian Civil War. I've just been down to Nigeria to conduct a 3-month ethnographic study as part of the first phase of my field study there, involving intensive interviews with key informants, traditional rulers, war veterans, civilian and military survivors of the war, as well as other residents in communities that witnessed bombardments or invasion during the Nigerian Civil War. And so I've been combining interviews, oral information, as well as geographical information data to map the heritage landscape of the Igbo people and see how the war impacted those, especially the physical representation of the war on their heritage landscape. The second phase of my fieldwork, I'm hoping to do a lot more ethnographic study, but also combine it with narrative art, where I am looking to teenagers or just young people generally to give an artistic representation of their knowledge or memory of the war, because I'm trying to track how, in the absence of the war history being taught in schools, I'm trying to track what or how the knowledge of the war is being passed down the generation. So what is the intergenerational transfer of knowledge/memory of the Nigerian Civil War? So in my interactions with my supervisors about my current experience in Nigeria, they've been jokingly asking me to sit in front of the news and take note of political happenings, because for the first time there's an Igbo candidate who is a frontrunner for Nigeria's 2023 general elections. And so there's been lots of reference to the Nigerian Civil War regarding this candidate, with some people trying to picture him as a neo-Biafran supporter, or even as a supporter of the IPOB group, which has now been categorized as a terrorist group by the Nigerian government. And so we see today that the legacies of the war continue to be ever so present in Nigeria's social and political environment. And this is not a surprise, because heritage is inherently political. And so most leaders who seek power would try to reach into history and weaponize heritage against their candidates or against people that they do not like. And so my research continues to take note of these happenings as how the legacies of conflict can impact on the social and political lives of the people even so many years after.